All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott from Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015 6th edition. We are in Section 4, Chapter 20, How to Authenticate and Authorize Users. As far as our objectives go, use the web forms template to create a web application that provides for basic user authentication. Modify an application so it provides for roles and define the roles and access rules for the application. Use the seed method to add initial data to the authentication database. Those are the applied objectives. The knowledge, distinguish between authentication and authorization. Describe the use of individual user account authentication. Describe how the login view and login status controls are used by the web form template. Describe the process of registering a user, logging in a user, changing a user's password that's provided by the web forms template. Describe how roles, users, and access rules are used with authentication and authorization. Explain why you must use MARS, multiple active result sets, and how you enable it. And finally, explain how you use code-first migrations to add custom user data to the authentication database. And as we get started on this, as I did in a previous chapter, I went back and looked here and said, I guess when you start, to keep it simple, authentication tells who you are. Authorization tells what you can do. All right. Now, I am an information technology instructor at Rankin Technical College in Wentzville, Missouri. When I was hired in here, one of the things that I was given, or one of the things they did the first day when I started, was they took my picture and gave me a badge. And you have to badge your way in to Rankin, and it keeps track of when you come into the system. There are also cameras around the door, so I guess they can probably tell when you leave too. I don't know. But this badge with my picture on it and barcode basically authenticates me to get into the system. Okay? Once I was hired in here, I was given keys to the information technology lab, or labs, I should say, and to the information technology faculty office. So in other words, after I was authenticated, I was authorized to do things, for lack of better words, things IT. Now I looked here and I saw another one I kind of like this. You may or may not. But it says here, authentication verifies you are who you say you are. Ways that you can authenticate, the one that most of us are used to is using a login form. You come in, for instance, if I wanted to get into my mail account at Rankin, I would type in mail.rankin.edu. And it would come up like this. All right? And that is not my password, believe it or not, because if I do put that in right now, I will get an error message. Okay? So, it asks for my username, and it asks for the password. There are other ways of authentication, and some of them are shown here. So as it says, authentication verifies you are who you say you are. Once you've been authenticated, you can be authorized. And that will basically decide the permissions that you have. Different ways that you can do that include access controls, secure objects and methods, and what are called ACLs, or access control lists. Now I found this article, and this article was from a same picture that's out on the system, and it's called "It's Me and Here's My Proof: why identity and authentication must remain distinct. And it's old, over 10 years old. It says, no matter what kinds of technological or procedural advancements occur, certain principles of computer science will remain, especially those concerning information security. It says, let's start by identifying concepts. Identity. A security principle you, or really your computer, wants to access the system. Because the system doesn't know you yet, you need to make a declaration of who you are. That who you are is your authentication. All right? So it says authentication is the answer to, okay, can you prove who you are, for lack of better words? Authorization says once you've successfully authenticated, the system will control the resources you're allowed to access. Now the system says here why identity and authentication must remain distinct. And this is actually in some ways I read through it, and it's so old that it may or may not make sense anymore. But one thing to realize as you go through this is things like biometrics are happening, where people can do retinal scans and fingerprint scans, etc. All right? So some of these lines between authentication and authorization, etc., as time's going on, are becoming blurred. All right, let's jump into the slides. Windows-based authentication is what most of us who use the Windows architecture are used to. Causes the browser to display a login box when the user attempts to access a restricted page. Supported by most browsers, configured through IIS Management Console, uses window user accounts and directory rights, is most appropriate for an intranet application. Individual user account authentication allows developers to code a login form that gets the username and password. Typically, they're going to be encrypted if the login uses a secure connection, and it does not necessarily rely on Windows user accounts. There are also third-party authentications, and maybe you've seen this. I've already tried to sign up for offers online, and occasionally what will happen is it'll ask me to log in, and other times it'll say, do you want to continue on using, for example, your Facebook or your Twitter account, type of an idea. These third-party authentication services, as it says here, allow users to use their existing logins and frees developers from having to worry about the secure storage of user credentials. So you can do some configuration on this as you're working on it. Let me check my time here. And I'm at 8 minutes, so I'm doing just fine. So how individual user authentication works. Again, this is taken right from the book on page 717. So they mention here, this is a typical series of exchanges that occur between a web browser and a server when the user attempts to access a page that uses individual accounts. The authentication process begins when the user requests the page. When the server receives the request, it checks to see if the user already has been authenticated. To do that, it looks for an authentication cookie. If it doesn't find it, it redirects the browser to a login page. Next, the user enters the username and password and posts the login page back to the server. If that name and password are found in the database, the server creates an authentication cookie and redirects the browser back to the original page. Oh, excuse me for a second. All right, sorry about that. I just proved you shouldn't take a drink of water while you're trying to talk. So, by default, the authentication cookie is sent as a session cookie. So again, to summarize, as shown on page 717 in the book, when ASP.NET receives a request for a protected page from a user who has not been authenticated, the user will be redirected to a login page. To be authenticated, the user's computer must contain an authentication cookie, which by default is saved as a session cookie. ASP.NET automatically creates an authentication cookie when the app indicates that the user should be authenticated. ASP.NET checks for the presence of such a cookie anytime it receives a request for a restricted page. The authentication cookie can be made persistent, in other words, made to last beyond the length of the session. Then the user will be authenticated automatically in future sessions until the cookie expires. Now, I'm going to stop here and pick it up on page 718 with an introduction to ASP.NET Identity shortly.